Hello and welcome. Today, we uncover a secret war within a war. A labyrinth of deception, cultural manipulation, and psychological sabotage that threatened to turn the tide of World War II from within. Imagine a world where soldiers disguised themselves not just with enemy uniforms, but with the very fabric of American culture, baseball, Hollywood, and slang, aiming to infiltrate and sow chaos behind Allied lines. Could a simple question about Wrigley Field reveal a spy? Were entire operations based on convincing someone they belonged, only to catch them out with a phrase as trivial as, "sorry"? What if the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't a tank or a bomb, but a shared joke, a familiar nickname, or a common habit that only Americans understand? And how far could deception go before it crossed into legal peril, turning soldiers into spies, prisoners into unlawful combatants? Did the Germans' daring plan to wear American uniforms behind enemy lines succeed, or did it backfire, leading to swift executions and a wave of paranoia that paralyzed entire armies? Was the entire operation a gamble that ultimately revealed more about the fragility of wartime trust than any battlefield victory? In this video, we will trace the incredible story of covert operations that aimed to create chaos through disguise and cultural deceit. An effort so audacious that it almost defied the laws of war, and examine how, despite its failure, the psychological and legal lessons of Operation Grafe continue to resonate today. The real story begins now, as we step into the shadowy world of deception and the fragile boundary between legality and treachery in wartime. December 17, 1944. A checkpoint stood vigil just outside the small Belgian town of Iwela, serving as a critical juncture between advancing Allied lines and the occupied territories. As a frigid winter morning cast a cold, gray pall over the landscape, a sturdy military jeep rolled to a halt, breaking the silence. The vehicle's driver was a seasoned soldier, and an alert military policeman, standing with his hand raised in the universal gesture to halt, stopped the vehicle. His breath was visible in the crisp, freezing air, drawing brief, ghostly clouds as he studied the occupants, 3 soldiers seated inside, clad in what appeared to be authentic American uniforms. Their gear was meticulously arranged, rifles slung in proper positions, the insignia and patches confidently displayed. They spoke in English that sounded almost genuine, convincing enough to fool the most trained ear. However, Sergeant William Creel had received specific intelligence that cast a shadow over his assumptions. An unsettling uncertainty gnawed at him, an awareness of a threat so bizarre it seemed almost impossible, a threat that defied everything about military tradition and the standards of honor he held sacred. The possibility had been introduced subtly. German soldiers sometimes operated covertly, dressed in American uniforms, speaking American words, creating confusion and chaos behind enemy lines. Driven by a keen sense of duty and suspicion, Creel decided to test the trio with what should have been a simple question, the password. The men hesitated before answering. When he repeated his ask, their confidence wavered, and their command of English began to crack, revealing hesitation and uncertainty. Sergeant Creel instantly noted the discrepancy, the way the words faltered, the mannerisms that seemed unnatural. His eyes flicked to their weapons. The firearms looked standard at first glance, but closer inspection revealed the unmistakable outline of British-made Sten guns. Wretchedly common among British forces but virtually unheard of in American military issues. Within moments, the foreigners were detained, and their disguises began to unravel. Underneath the olive drab of their uniforms, the hidden truth was exposed. They wore German field gray, a color as recognizable as any watermark of enemy origin. They were identified as Untisha Manfred Perus, Oberfenrig Gunther Billing, and Geta Wilhelm Schmidt. 3 individuals destined now to become the most infamous prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge. What none of them knew in that moment was that their arrest would set off a wave of paranoia affecting the entire American military apparatus, unleashing an unprecedented campaign of cultural and psychological interrogation. This campaign would convert every checkpoint into a quiz show, every casual chat into a test of national identity, forcing soldiers to prove their allegiance through constant scrutiny. The terrifying logic underpinning this new vigilantism was not based on complex codes or clandestine ciphers but on the most ordinary of everyday knowledge: baseball statistics, state capital names, Hollywood gossip. The threat was no longer hidden behind tangled knots of secret messages but embedded in the shared cultural fabric of America itself. The chapters of this campaign of suspicion awoke prematurely in late October of the preceding year, on the 22nd day, at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. On that day, Adolf Hitler summoned SS Obergruppenführer Otto Schott-See in serious conversation that would have profound implications for the waning days of the Third Reich. The Führer handed Schott-See a mission cloaked in deception, an operation unprecedented in scope and daring. A plan to create chaos and confusion within enemy lines on a scale that could only be described as audacious. At that moment, Skorzeny, already renowned among Germany's most ruthless and feared commandos, became central to Hitler's plans. To understand the full context of this mission, one must recall Skorzeny's daring past. In September of 1943, he led a daring glider assault that rescued Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison near Gran Sasso, evading Allied pursuit in a light aircraft that barely avoided the jagged peaks of the Italian Alps. Later, in October of the following year, he meticulously orchestrated the kidnapping of Miklos Horthy Jr., forcing Hungary's long-standing regent to resign, thus prolonging the country's involvement in the war. Now, Hitler entrusted him with perhaps the most ambitious operation yet, launching a massive counter-offensive through the dense Ardennes forest. The plan was to thrust decisively toward the crucial port of Antwerp, a logistical colossus vital to Allied supply lines. This sudden and swift attack aimed to sever the Allied forces' connection, creating a Greek tragedy replayed on a grand scale. A replay of May 1940 when German tanks had reached the English Channel in barely days, sparking chaos and confusion among the defenders. But this time, success would hinge on unprecedented speed and precision. The Germans required to capture at least one bridge over the Meuse River intact before the relentless advance of Allied engineers could destroy it. To this end, Skorzeny was tasked with forming a disguises rooted in the use of enemy uniforms became an ingenious yet perilous tactic, as Skorzeny and his men donned American and British military attire. Hitler explained that small units adopting enemy clothing had the potential to sow chaos on the battlefield, creating confusion that could disrupt enemy communications, mislead their troops, and induce panic among their ranks. Such deception, if executed effectively, could be a powerful tool to destabilize the opposition's operations and give their side a strategic advantage. Skorzeny listened carefully, fully grasping the gravity of the situation and the serious legal implications under international law. The Hague Convention of the year 1907 explicitly stipulated that soldiers captured while wearing the insignia or uniform of the enemy could lose their rights as prisoners of war. Instead, they could be considered unlawful combatants or spies and, under certain circumstances, subject to execution. This recognition of the inherent risk posed by uniform deception sparked intense discussion among high-ranking officials, including General Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt. Hitler, confident in his interpretation, assured Scott-C that such tactics were legitimate, provided his men removed the enemy uniforms before engaging in actual fighting, thus avoiding the legal pitfalls associated with direct combat in enemy clothing. Within a few days, Scott-C presented his detailed plans to General Jodl. He requested a force of about 3,300 men specifically trained to understand the nuances of English and American dialects. His vision was to assemble a unit capable of operating behind enemy lines, on the basis of language and cultural familiarity, to carry out covert operations. On October the 25th, the Oberkommando des Westens issued a directive to all command posts along the Western Front. This order explicitly sought volunteers who were fluent in English, particularly those familiar with American idiomatic expressions, to be part of a clandestine commando unit involved in secret missions. The directive, personally signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittel, called for soldiers with demonstrated fluency in English and a working knowledge of American slang and idioms. Scott-C understood that this announcement would reach Allied intelligence within a matter of days, prompting him to consider whether the operation could be cancelled before it commenced. However, Hitler, maintaining his unwavering confidence in the plan, refused to grant permission for its cancellation. As expected, Allied intelligence intercepted and reviewed the order by late November. Yet, many officers dismissed the transmission as a clever decoy, unwilling to believe that the Germans would openly advertise such a covert initiative. Such skepticism was rooted in the assumption that the Germans would never be so brazen as to publicize an operation designed for deception. Nonetheless, the truth of the matter was that volunteers began arriving from across various branches of the German military, even though most had only a vague idea of what they had signed up for. They had been recruited under the guise of a routine military assignment, unaware of the true scope or nature of the secret operation. Among the recruits was Fritz Priest, a 21-year-old private in the Luftwaffe who was specially trained to serve as an English translator. He had initially believed he would be interrogating American prisoners away from frontline combat zones, a relatively safe task. Instead, Fritz found himself confined behind barbed wire at a training camp established at Grafenwehr, located in eastern Bavaria, where strict security measures were enforced, creating an atmosphere of extreme caution. The camp was so secure that one man was shot immediately after revealing too many details in a letter sent home. The volunteers learned about the true purpose of their mission only after their arrival, shattering any illusions of normalcy. The reality of the situation, from Scott-C's perspective, was almost absurdly comical, if not for the graveness of the stakes. Out of the roughly 2,500 men assembled, only about 10 actually possessed full command of spoken English, including a deep understanding of American idiomatic expressions. An additional 30 to 40 men spoke English fairly well but had little understanding of American slang or idiomatic nuances. About 120 to 150 had moderate proficiency, capable of basic communication, while the majority had only learned enough English during school years to say simple words such as yes or no. Later, Skorzeny reflected that after a few weeks under this misaligned and often chaotic training, the experience was nothing short of terrifying. The less proficient volunteers were instructed in a peculiar, almost farcical coordination tactic. If approached by Americans, they were to exclaim, "Sorry," and then quickly open their trousers to imitate having diarrhea, and hastily leave the scene, a crude disguise intended to fake illness. The equipment situation was equally dire. Requests had been made to procurement authorities for a modest arsenal of military vehicles and gear, including 15 Sherman tanks, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 jeeps, 40 motorcycles, 120 trucks, and enough British and American uniforms to outfit the entire force. However, the delivery of equipment was woefully inadequate. Only 2 Sherman tanks arrived, both in poor condition, one of them almost immediately after their formation. The units reserved for the upcoming clandestine operation faced a series of significant challenges regarding their equipment and appearance. Instead of receiving the specifically requested American military hardware, the operations planners were supplied with a collection of German weaponry and vehicles, which posed a serious problem for their mission's disguise and credibility. The consignment included 5 Panther tanks, notable for their formidable strength and armor, alongside 6 armored cars and 6 armored personnel carriers, all of which bore unmistakable German design features. Additionally, there were 5 Sturmpanzer assault guns, often referred to as Sturmmuts, a heavier, more assault-oriented armored vehicle, also German-made. The Panthers, intended to be a key element of the deception, were hastily camouflaged with sheet metal cladding to mask their authentic German markings. These tanks were painted in typical olive drab, a color used frequently by American forces, and adorned with white star insignia painted on their sides. Scorzani, reflecting candidly on the quality and effectiveness of the disguises, admitted that these visual deceptions would likely fool only very inexperienced American soldiers, particularly those observing from considerable distances at night, where such details became harder to distinguish. The situation regarding the infantry and supporting personnel uniform arrangements was even more problematic and chaotic. The uniforms available were a haphazard mix, many of which were not suitably matched to the intended American appearance. A significant number of the soldiers were armed and dressed in uniforms originally issued to British, Polish, or Russian troops. Shockingly, some of these uniforms were from summer issue, despite the operation scheduled for December, when winter gear would have been necessary for optimal concealment and protection. Furthermore, some of the clothing bore bloodstains or bore markings such as P, indicating Polish origin, which served as telltale signs that could damage the deception's credibility and potentially endanger the entire mission. Across Germany, units inadvertently contributed to the confusion by responding to the initial request with whatever equipment they could quickly find, regardless of its origin or appropriateness. As a result, the brigade ended up flooded with Polish and Russian military supplies, incorrectly issued and often outdated, and these came from units with little or no understanding of the operation's true purpose. The sheer mix of foreign weapons and uniforms created a confusing patchwork, one that could easily raise suspicion if any individuals directly involved in the operation had become careless in their misidentification. Amidst this chaos, Scorzani managed to secure a modest number of authentic American uniforms and weapons, but only enough for the elite groups of commandos who would undertake the most critical and sensitive parts of the operation. Recognizing that language barrier and cultural disparity could be significant obstacles, he decided to assemble a special unit composed of the best English speakers among the troops. This unit was to be known as Einheil, a name derived in honor of SS Captain Ernstello, who was chosen to lead their efforts. These specially trained teams underwent intensive instruction, despite the strict and limited time frame, to equip them with the skills needed to convincingly imitate American soldiers. Their thorough training involved memorizing the organization and customs of the American military. They learned to recognize and correctly display badges of rank corresponding to U.S. Army standards, understand conduct, and follow drill procedures typical of American troops. To further enhance their authenticity, some team members were sent to P camps at Kustrin and Lindbergh, where they practiced their English skills with captured American soldiers, engaging in conversations designed to improve pronunciation, idiomatic understanding, and slang usage. Analyzing American films became an integral part of their training, helping them to imitate American accents and familiarize themselves with cultural nuances. The commandos studied American brand names, popular sports teams, well-known songs, and Hollywood celebrities, information crucial to blending seamlessly into the enemy ranks by mirroring civilian and military behaviors alike. They worked on their walk, trying to emulate American soldiers' gait. They learned how to smoke their cigarettes in the manner typical of American troops, and even how to chew gum just as Americans did. Each detail was essential in cultivating the most convincing disguise possible. The operational plans were divided into 3 main categories, each with specific objectives and methods. The first involved demolition teams, typically consisting of 5 or 6 men, tasked with destroying strategic infrastructure such as bridges, ammunition dumps, and fuel depots to hamper enemy mobility and supply lines. Second, reconnaissance patrols, composed of 3 to 4 soldiers, would be sent ahead both on either side of the Meuse River, facilitating timely intelligence gathering and subversion, by passing on false orders to American units they encountered. Their tactics included reversing road signs, dismantling minefield warnings, and cordoning off key roads with fake mine warnings, all designed to sow confusion and hinder American advance. The third type of operation focused on leading attacking German forces, where specially trained commando units would work in coordination with the regular German military to sabotage enemy communication infrastructure, such as cutting telephone wires and destroying radio stations, and broadcast deceptive orders to mislead American under the directive of Joachim Peiper. The German forces had meticulously devised a plan in which the momentum of Peiper's armored spearhead, if it broke through decisively and swiftly, could serve as a distraction or a diversion. This strategy was designed so that under the ensuing chaos and confusion, the disguised troops under Skorzeny's command might seize the opportunity to slip past American defenses and reach the vital bridges before the American engineers could destroy them. The entire operation hinged on the element of surprise and swift execution, exploiting moments when the enemy's attention was diverted elsewhere. This intense and covert phase of the offensive commenced in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1844, igniting the forests of the Ardennes with the chaos of war. Under the cover of darkness, more than 200,000 German soldiers launched what was to be Hitler's final great attempt to break through the Western Allies' lines during this conflict. From the very start, the attack was almost flawlessly executed, catching the American forces, spread thinly across an extensive 80-mile front, completely unprepared for such an immediate, overwhelming assault. Faced with numerically superior German units, comprising 30 divisions supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, the poorly regarded and relatively inexperienced or battle-weary American divisions found themselves in a dire predicament. The German artillery unleashed a relentless barrage, transforming the cold, fractured morning into a cacophony of exploding shells and roaring cannons that shattered the stillness of the frozen landscape. High-powered searchlights cut through low-hanging clouds, casting stark illumination over the fractured terrain and the chaos unfolding on the battlefield. American infantry units pushed forward through snow-laden forests, endeavoring to hold their ground against the ferocious onslaught, while columns of panzer tanks rolled into action along narrow, winding roads. During the initial hours, everything appeared to proceed according to the Germans' carefully crafted plan. Inspired by cunning and coordination, the Einhalle teams, operating under cover of the confusion and chaos, infiltrated American lines dressed in captured uniforms, driving stolen jeeps. Their mission was covertly executed. They slipped through the dispersing American forces, sowing chaos and misdirection. One of these teams dashed directly into an American-held town, meticulously assessing its defenses. Leaving behind the impression that the German assault was advancing aggressively in that sector, they then hijacked an American convoy of armored vehicles and supplies, misdirecting it onto the wrong roads. Two other teams successfully created chaos elsewhere by misguiding Allied convoys, cutting communication lines, removing road signs, and spreading false rumors of a more extensive German breakthrough than what was actually occurring, all designed to deepen the confusion among Allied forces. However, by December the 17th, the realities on the ground shattered the confidence of the Germans in their initial operational plans. The 1st SS Panzer Division failed to reach its targeted objectives on time, hindered by determined American resistance at Ellenborn Ridge, which denied the Germans control over the northern routes essential for their advance. Simultaneously, American defenders mounted a fierce, tenacious fight at the strategic town of St. Vith, delaying the German timetable by nearly an entire week. The rapid breakthrough, which was critical for the success of Operation Griff, failed to materialize, and the anticipated swift victory eluded the Germans. Recognizing the bleak situation by that very day, Skorzeny understood that the original objectives of his mission, an incursion behind enemy lines to cause maximum disruption, were now practically unattainable. To adapt, he attended a high-level staff conference at the headquarters of the 6th Panzer Army, where he proposed that his brigade be reassigned and used as a conventional fighting unit rather than continue as specialized commandos. His suggestion was accepted. Orders were given for Panzer Brigade 150 to regroup south of Malmedy and report directly to the 1st SS Panzer Division, although by that point, some of Skorzeny's commando teams had already succeeded in their missions, having infiltrated deep behind American lines before the collapse of the operation. Of course, not all the teams of the clandestine operation managed to escape unscathed. Some were captured when their passwords or code words were challenged by nervous American soldiers, who noticed anomalies such as British weapons, German military boots, or language barriers. Many of these operatives struggled under pressure to answer simple questions about American culture or language, revealing their true identities. The arrest on December the 17th of the agents Paris, Billing, and Schmidt near Ivy inadvertently sowed panic and chaos, ultimately shaping the operation's perception as a disorganized and incomplete success. Interrogations of these captured agents yielded startling revelations. Chief among these was Schmidt's startling claim that their mission extended beyond mere sabotage or infiltration. He asserted that they were part of a larger, more sinister plan, an operation designed to penetrate the very core of Allied military command. According to him, this secret agenda was to infiltrate the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, with the potential goal of capturing or there has never been tangible evidence to suggest that any such comprehensive or clandestine plan ever truly existed. The true objective of the operation was apparently to seize control of strategic bridges spanning the Meuse River, a task that demanded precision and stealth. However, the official statement about this supposed plan had immediate, far-reaching repercussions that quickly unsettled the entire Allied command structure. Within mere hours after the announcement, security measures around General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who held the role of Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, were drastically intensified. The once open and accessible headquarters at Versailles transformed into a virtual fortress, with the general almost isolated within the confines of his headquarters, surrounded by guards who meticulously scrutinized every individual attempting to enter. The atmosphere grew tense as reports indicated that Eisenhower was immensely frustrated, particularly because this heightened security and confinement persisted through the Christmas holiday season, a time usually reserved for reflection and family gatherings. After enduring several days of these restrictions, Eisenhower, clearly agitated and feeling increasingly trapped, defiantly declared that he needed to leave and expressed that he no longer cared if anyone attempted to assassinate him. His words reflected a growing sense of frustration and perhaps desperation. But the paranoia was not confined solely to Eisenhower himself. It quickly permeated the broader Allied forces, who were already under immense pressure due to a recent German offensive that pushed their lines back and caused a state of heightened alertness. The suspicion of infiltration and espionage drove the deployment of numerous checkpoints along the rear areas of the Allied forces, which considerably hampered the movement of troops, vehicles, and supplies. American military policemen, or MPs, began a procedure of relentless questioning of every soldier passing through these points, employing a series of questions designed to identify German spies disguised as Americans. These questions ranged from straightforward queries about American geography to popular sporting trivia, Hollywood celebrities, and even American slang expressions. Typical examples included inquiries like, "What is the capital of Illinois?" "Who was victorious in the World Series in 1940? "Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend?" and "Which team plays at Wrigley Field?" Other questions veered into more personal territory, such as, "Who is Betty Grable married to?" or military positioning queries like, "Where does the guard stand in a football formation?" There were also questions about notable figures such as Frank Sinatra or even the names of presidential pets. The MPs were noticeably improvisational, crafting questions on the spot based on anything they could recall related to American trivia, resulting in stark disorder and bizarre interactions. Many genuine American soldiers found themselves flummoxed by these questions. Regional differences meant that a soldier from one part of the United States often lacked knowledge about details familiar to those from elsewhere. Educational disparities further complicated the situation, as some Americans never learned state capitals or followed baseball closely enough to answer the questions confidently. The checkpoints and the interrogations they entailed caused numerous complications, sometimes even leading to high-ranking officers being detained under false assumptions. For instance, General Omar Bradley was held for several hours after correctly naming Springfield as the capital of Illinois, only for the MP conducting the questioning to mistakenly believe Chicago held that title, thus holding him until his identity was verified. Similarly, Brigadier General Bruce Clark was held at gunpoint after mistakenly claiming that the Chicago Cubs played in the American League, a fact that was actually incorrect, leading to his detention until his credentials could be checked. In one bizarre incident, a captain was detained for an entire week after being caught wearing German boots he had taken as souvenirs, a seemingly innocuous act that was treated with suspicion. British soldiers faced similar difficulties. When reconnaissance officer David Nann was asked to identify the winner of the 1940 World Series, he could only honestly admit that he had no idea. These questions, often about baseball, geography, Hollywood, or American popular culture, posed a significant challenge for soldiers from the United Kingdom, who were rarely familiar with such details. When their inability to answer accurately was discovered, they too were detained until their true identities could be confirmed through other means, further clogging an already strained system. Some American troops, frustrated and disbelieving of the absurdity of these interrogations, responded by deliberately providing incorrect answers, which only led to their own detention. Others reacted with anger and confrontation, particularly when junior enlisted men conducted the questioning, leading to tense confrontations that further slowed troop movement and logistical operations. The overall effect of this heightened paranoia was highly disruptive to military operations. Movements that should have taken only a few hours endured delays extending over multiple days because every vehicle and individual had to be scrutinized, questioned, and sometimes detained. This atmosphere of suspicion and excessive security, although intended to prevent infiltration by enemy spies, created a chaotic and sometimes absurd environment where genuine soldiers were stalled, confused, and deeply frustrated, all during a critical phase of military campaign planning. The operation was abruptly halted, forcing every individual involved to be subjected to an intense series of interrogations. As movements were scrutinized, supply convoys, critical arteries for advancing forces, found themselves stranded at checkpoints, their drivers required to painstakingly verify their American identities before proceeding. These delays were not merely inconvenient, they slowed down strategic reinforcements, which were vital in reinforcing sectors already under threat. Consequently, units rushing to bolster fragile regions within the American lines were compelled to wait through repetitive and often probing examinations, their progress hampered by relentless scrutiny. Within the command structure, a wave of suspicion began to seep through. Higher-ranking officers found themselves questioning the reliability of reports from their subordinates, who, in turn, grew anxious about the pervasive infiltration of enemy agents. The atmosphere of distrust grew thick, with many personnel turning suspicious of those around them. This suspicion reached the ranks of the infiltrators themselves, fostering a psychological environment of constant paranoia. Those German operatives who had managed to penetrate the American defenses experienced profound mental strain, detrimental to their morale and effectiveness. Many of these infiltrators, finding themselves unable to move freely behind enemy lines, faced additional complications. They discovered that their training, which had heavily emphasized military procedures, insignia, and the organization of American forces, was insufficient for the reality they encountered during interrogation. They had memorized the hierarchy of the American military and studied their combat tactics, yet they had neglected to prepare for more mundane but revealing cultural questions. Some were caught off guard by inquiries into American sports statistics, such as baseball, popular American celebrities, Hollywood marriages, or regional slang terms. Such questions betrayed their superficial familiarity with American culture, exposing gaps in their concealment strategies. In a bid to evade capture or interrogation, some infiltrators resorted to risky strategies, attempting to circumvent checkpoints altogether. They would navigate through forests or travel cross-country to avoid known positions of patrols. However, such clandestine routes also made them more conspicuous, as they became easier targets for American patrols keenly observing movement in remote areas. Conversely, others tried to bluff their way through checkpoints, concocting plausible excuses for their inability to respond to questions, hoping to appear genuine enough to pass unnoticed. Yet, these efforts rarely succeeded, and most infiltrators fell into American hands. Between the 16th of December and the 31st of December in the year 1944, the United States forces captured a total of 23 members involved in Operation Greif. Most of these arrests occurred in December of that year, with the team leader, Gauss Schultz, being captured at a later point and subsequently tried in May of 1945. Each individual caught was subsequently subjected to a military tribunal, where the legal framework was well established under international law. According to the provisions of the Hague Convention, specifically Article 23 regarding land warfare, it was explicitly forbidden to improperly utilize enemy military insignia or uniforms for deceptive purposes. It was established that soldiers caught wearing the enemy's uniform and carrying out military operations could not be classified as prisoners of war but rather as spies, an offense that carried severe consequences. The first of these military trials was initiated at Hungry-Chapelle on the 21st of December in 1944. The defendants, Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt, faced formal charges of violating the laws of war by deploying American uniforms and insignia during active operations. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They had been captured while clad in American military uniforms, wielding American weapons, and bearing American identification, yet underneath their attire, they concealed German field gray uniforms. The trials moved swiftly. Given the compelling evidence, the defendants were promptly convicted on charges of espionage and breaches of international law, and the court sentenced them to death by firing squad. On the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas that year, the sentences were executed with deliberate efficiency. American military police personnel escorted these 3 Germans to the designated execution site. Captain J. Iser from the 633rd Medical Clearing Station prepared them for the final moment by pinning white paper targets over their hearts. Schmidt's customary glasses were removed to prevent any unnecessary religious or superstitious comfort. The prisoners were blindfolded, and uniformed military police formed a firing squad to carry out the sentence. As the execution was carried out, Billing, with a resolute voice, shouted in what was likely his final act, "Long live our Führer Adolf Hitler." Immediately after, rifles fired a devastating volley, claiming the lives of the 3 men in an instant. Their bodies were carefully taken down, collected, and transported away from the site, to be laid to rest according to military protocol. In due course, their bodies were interred at the German military cemetery located at Lommel in Belgium. This resting place now holds the remains of more than 39,000 other German soldiers who lost their lives during the war. Additionally, 13 other operatives involved in Operation Greif faced a similar fate. They too were tried and executed at either Hungry-Chapelle or Norbert Pollock, Ralph Benjamin Meir, Hans Witzuk, Ottawa, Alfred France, and Anton Morik. All members of the same clandestine operation, faced summary execution by firing squads. Each of their killings was preceded by a rigorous military tribunal, where the defendants were found guilty of breaching the boundaries set by the Heg Convention, a treaty that aimed to regulate conduct in wartime. These military courts meticulously examined the offenses, and their verdicts were subsequently scrutinized and endorsed by senior commanders high in the chain of command, ensuring that the process followed strict military protocols. The actual executions themselves were carried out with clinical precision, executed swiftly and without apparent show of malice or personal emotion, yet undeniably devoid of mercy for those involved. One notable figure, team leader Guy Schultz, was subjected to a military tribunal in May of 1945, and his death sentence was carried out near the town of Branch on June 14 of the same year. The timing of his trial, being delayed until after Germany's surrender, remains shrouded in mystery, with the exact reasons for this postponement unclear to historians. Similarly, the orders that finally led to his execution have not been definitively established, adding an element of lingering uncertainty. What is known is that the United States Ninth Army was responsible for executing the sentence, thus enforcing the judgment handed down by military authority. Across the course of the operation, a total of 17 individuals involved in Operation Greif were subjected to execution solely for the grave offense of wearing the uniforms of the enemy, a move designed to disrupt and deceive, yet which ultimately resulted in severe punishment for relatively modest tactical gains. Despite these executions, the operation's strategic achievements remained minimal. No bridges managed to fall into Allied hands, and the extent of destruction caused by demolitions was negligible. Critical communications lines scarcely suffered lasting damage, and only minor sabotage efforts, such as the reversal of a few road signs, were accomplished. Exploiting the chaos, a handful of telephone lines were severed, and some units of the American forces received deceptive, false orders. Although most of these erroneous commands were swiftly corrected, the psychological impact on Allied troops was profound, far outweighing any tangible tactical benefit. In the days that followed, American soldiers operated under a persistent cloud of suspicion, convinced that German infiltrators could be lurking among them at any moment. This paranoia deeply affected the decision-making process across all levels of command, sowing distrust and confusion. During this period, Supreme Commander Eisenhower was confined, effectively isolated from real-time battlefield intelligence, preventing him from observing the extent of the enemy threat firsthand at a crucial early phase of the offensive. Delays at checkpoints slowed the American response to the German incursion, resulting in units that should have responded within hours taking days instead. This widespread suspicion and uncertainty severely degraded unit cohesion, as soldiers who were supposed to be alert for the enemy instead became preoccupied with fears about potential Germans in their midst. Despite the disruptions caused by Operation Griff and its failures, the Battle of the Bulge went on in its own fierce course, independent of the operation's outcome. German forces managed to push deeply into the American lines, creating a salient, the prominent bulge in the front, which lent the battle its name. At Bastogne, American defenders refused to yield despite being surrounded on all sides. On December 22, 1944, German officers delivered an ultimatum demanding surrender. In a move that has become legendary, the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded to the Germans with a single, typed word: nuts. This succinct reply became an emblem of American resilience and defiance, conveying that the Germans could take their surrender and shove it, in a manner of speaking. Initially, the confused German officers struggled to understand the cryptic reply. They inquired what the word meant, and were told it equated roughly to a blunt refusal: go to hell. Fortified by this landmark stand, the 101st Airborne Division held their position in Bastogne until they were relieved by Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army on December 26. Remarkably, after breaking the German siege, Patton's forces executed a swift and strategic 90-degree maneuver, a remarkable turn in their campaign, that drove northward to relieve the besieged town. By early January, thanks to relentless Allied counterattacks, the encircling bulge was eliminated, and the front lines were restored to their previous positions. The entire Battle of the Bulge lasted from December 16, 1944, until January 25, 1945. It involved more than 1 million men on both sides, making it the largest battle fought by the United States Army outside the scope of the Civil War. The American casualties were staggering, with over 80,000 men wounded, including nearly 19,000 killed and approximately 23,000 captured. German losses were comparable, reflecting the epic, brutal nature of the conflict that raged across the Ardennes forest. The losses they suffered simply could not be offset or compensated for under any circumstances. The battle in question signified a crucial turning point, effectively bringing Germany's ability to launch large-scale offensive operations in the Western theater of the conflict to an end. Adolf Hitler had placed his hopes and resources heavily on the Ardennes offensive, known historically as the Battle of the Bulge, wagering everything on its success. Unfortunately for him, that gamble ended in failure, irrevocably reversing German fortunes on the Western Front. By the 17th of December, during the waning days of that fierce struggle, Otto Skorzény's unit, The Panzer Brigade 150 transitioned from its initial engagement mode into more traditional, conventional military operations, marking the conclusion of what was known as Operation Greif. Just a few days later, on the 21st of December, that same brigade launched an attack aimed at capturing the strategic location of Malmi. Despite several assaults, they were repelled and forced to retreat, suffering setbacks that underscored the resilience of their opponents. During this period, Otto Skorzeny was wounded, caught in the blast of artillery shrapnel near the Lineville line, injury that temporarily incapacitated him but did not lead to his immediate removal from the field. He recovered from his wounds over time and continued to serve diligently until the very end of the war, remaining loyal to his cause. In May of the year 1945, with Germany's surrender inevitable and imminent, Skorzeny ultimately capitulated and turned himself over to American forces, specifically surrendering to the 13th Infantry Regiment. Following his surrender, he was placed in custody and held for approximately 2 years while proceedings and investigations into his actions took place. In the year 1947, during a series of war crimes trials known as the DHA trials, Skorzeny and 9 other officers from the Panzer Brigade 150 stood accused of serious violations of wartime conduct. Among the charges were allegations of improperly using American military uniforms, disguising themselves in American gear to infiltrate enemy positions, and then engaging in treacherous attacks that resulted in firing upon Allied forces, which was a grave breach of military regulations and international law. Additional accusations claimed that the brigade officers improperly obtained American clothing and Red Cross parcels from prisoners held in camps designated as P camps, places used to hold prisoners of war and other detainees. Otto Skorzeny's defense team sought to clarify the purpose behind their client's actions. They argued that, contrary to the allegations, his men had received explicit orders to strip away their American uniforms before engaging in actual combat, emphasizing that their uniforms and disguises were intended solely for infiltration and deception purposes, not for actively fighting. This distinction between deceptive tactics and direct combat engagement became the crux of the defense's argument. The significance of their case was heightened when a surprise witness for the defense, Yo Thomas, a former British combat experience officer and specialist in clandestine operations, gave testimony that proved pivotal. Yo Thomas described how Allied forces, during operations in France, had employed similar tactics, with personnel donning enemy uniforms behind enemy lines as part of their covert activities. His first-hand account reinforced the notion that disguising oneself in enemy uniforms, when used strictly for deception or stealth, was within the accepted bounds of military strategy, and clearly distinguished from the act of actively fighting while disguised. The military tribunal carefully examined this distinction, ultimately concluding that there was no concrete proof establishing that Skorzeny ordered his men to engage in combat while dressed in American uniforms. The tribunal's verdict was to acquit all the defendants, accepting the defense's arguments and evidence that their actions, under specific orders and circumstances, did not constitute war crimes. However, the verdict did not arrive without controversy. The case elicited considerable debate within military and legal circles. It appeared paradoxical that 17 soldiers from Skorzeny's unit had previously been executed in December of the previous year for the same alleged offenses, wearing American uniforms, captured in those uniforms, and engaged in combat, while Skorzeny and his group, with more detailed evidence indicating their uniforms had been removed before fighting, were acquitted. The critical differences seemed to revolve around timing and the available evidence. The soldiers executed earlier had been caught in the act of fighting in enemy uniforms, a clear violation that left little room for defense, while in Scorzini's case, the orders he claimed to have issued seemed to demonstrate compliance with the legal constraints. This trial cemented an important legal precedent concerning wartime conduct. It established that the strategic use of enemy uniforms for deception, what the military term ruse de guerre, could be legally permissible if certain conditions were met. In particular, it was deemed acceptable within international wartime law that combatants could wear enemy uniforms to carry out spying or infiltration missions, provided they removed their costumes before engaging in combat. This legal interpretation would influence the understanding and application of the laws of war for many years to come, shaping international conventions and military practices. Ottavio Scorzini, during times of national crisis, symbols of cultural identity, such as references to baseball and Hollywood, distinctions between state capitals, and iconic movie stars, began to embody the very essence of how a nation's cultural fabric could serve as a vital shield against external threats. These symbols, though seemingly casual or superficial on the surface, revealed deeper truths about what it truly meant to be American. Despite the chaos and unpredictability surrounding them, improvisation and an often disorderly manner of operation proved remarkably effective in identifying and exposing infiltrators. This was especially true because such enemies lacked the nuanced cultural knowledge that Americans acquired naturally from childhood. Being American, it turned out, entailed more than just fluency in the English language or wearing the appropriate uniform. It involved sharing collective cultural experiences, a web of common references, memories, and traditions that could not be easily imparted through short-term training programs. These deeply ingrained cultural bonds became apparent only when they were tested under conditions of extreme stress and suspicion. This form of cultural cohesion, often overlooked or taken for granted in peaceful times, displayed its true importance as a security asset during critical moments of threat. When enemy infiltrators tried to blend into the American ranks, they were often foiled precisely because they lacked the familiar cultural touchstones that Americans instinctively understood. The significance of this was exemplified in the case of the 17 men who lost their lives during Operation Grafe, a secret military undertaking that is remembered today primarily through their memorials in military cemeteries and detailed official histories. Their graves, located at Lommel, are treated with the same level of respect and care as those of soldiers who perished amidst traditional combat, signaling the enduring recognition of their sacrifice. The cemetery where these fallen are laid to rest makes no distinction between soldiers who fell in combat and those who were executed as spies, a few of whom had crossed dangerous lines in an effort to infiltrate enemy lines. All are acknowledged as fallen soldiers of Germany, their fates intertwined in the complex tapestry of war. Among these men was Manfred Peruz, who was just 23 years old at the moment of his execution. Gunther Billing, then only 21, remained steadfast in his unwavering Nazi convictions until his final breath. Wilhelm Schmidt, aged 24, faced his death with calm acceptance, resigned to his fate without outward protest. Each of these young men was someone's son, perhaps someone's brother, making their tragic end all the more poignant. Their choices, the decisions that led to their participation in such perilous operations, culminated that cold morning in Belgium. They led them to the secret posts, the blindfolds, the rifles pointed at their heads in an ultimate act of wartime judgment. The legacy of Operation Grafe extended beyond its immediate tactical aims. It served as a stark reminder that special operations, no matter how daring or carefully crafted, could never fully substitute for the failure or shortcomings of conventional military strategies. The operation's inability to accomplish its core goal, capturing bridges or penetrating the defenses, was evidence that without the physical achievement of such strategic objectives, deception and confusion remained incomplete tools. Nevertheless, in terms of psychological impact, Operation Grafe achieved a victory that far surpassed its actual military outcomes. The mere threat or possibility of infiltration functioning successfully was enough to sow chaos and panic among hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. The fear generated by the operation created a psychological landscape defined by uncertainty and suspicion, affecting military planning and decisions at a scale far larger than the infiltrators' covert activities alone. This disparity between perceptions of vulnerability and the reality of shifted intentions became a fundamental lesson in modern strategic thinking around psychological warfare. By the end of January in the year 1945, the Battle of the Bulge drew to a close, marking a turning point in the conflict. The Allied forces, having pushed back against the last German offensive in the Ardennes, resumed their relentless advance into Germany. Within a span of just under 4 months, the weight of Nazi resistance crumbled entirely, culminating in the self-inflicted suicide of Adolf Hitler within his bunker in Berlin. Germany, overwhelmed and exhausted from years of brutal conflict, surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May, 1845, bringing an end to the Second World War in Europe. The 17 men who had participated in Operation Grafe, having already been executed, thus lay silent in their graves, victims of a tragic culmination born from strategic failure. Their violent end was sealed on Belgian soil, far from the comfort of home. Although their mission did not succeed in achieving its immediate tactical objectives, the chaos and fear their actions induced served a crucial purpose. It hampered Allied operations during the critical initial phase of the overall offensive, sowing confusion and mistrust at a pivotal moment. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking to the British Parliament on the 18th of January in the year 1945, delivered a memorable declaration. Despite the ongoing battles, he characterized this fierce and complex struggle as undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and predicted that it would come to be remembered this entire episode was, at its core, a distinctly American endeavor, culminating in an unmistakably American victory. The guards posted at the checkpoint, questioning inane details such as the participants' knowledge of baseball, were unknowingly weaving the fabric of folklore, creating stories that would linger long after the actual incident. At the moment, these guards were merely responding to an urgent problem, improvising rudimentary security measures aimed at identifying individuals who might pose a threat. Their solution, while arguably simplistic, proved remarkably effective because it was rooted in a shared cultural understanding that was genuine and instinctive. The reason this approach worked so well was that Americans had an intuitive grasp of their own culture. They grew up immersed in familiar references from baseball, Hollywood movies, and their nation's capital, absorbing this knowledge naturally through daily life. Conversely, Germans attempting to masquerade as Americans could gather facts. They could memorize details, but they could never quite replicate that effortless cultural fluency. This ability to seamlessly navigate a complex cultural landscape or utilize shared cultural touchstones was something that could not be quickly learned by outsiders without years of lived experience. This fundamental distinction, between merely acquiring facts and genuinely internalizing culture, proved to be of critical importance. The failure of the German operatives to pass as Americans bore out a principle that remains highly relevant in contemporary security and intelligence work. That cultural knowledge, absorbed through the years of real-life experience, cannot be swiftly transferred or taught to adults who do not share that background. Their deficiencies lay not in a lack of intelligence but in the impossibility of instantaneously developing the same fluency that comes from a lifetime of immersion. Modern elite special operations teams have studied and adapted lessons from the mixed outcomes of Operation Grafe. Knowing that cultural fluency cannot be ingrained overnight, intelligence agencies now dedicate years to grooming deep cover agents. Preparing these agents demands extensive protocols, media immersion, language acquisition, behavioral coaching, and cultural acclimation, though these measures, while necessary, are often still insufficient by themselves. Achieving true cultural nuance requires actual immersion and ongoing exposure over extended periods. The ongoing challenge, which persists through the decades, is that culture isn't something readily taught within the confines of a classroom. It is acquired through lived experience, through participation in a shared social fabric over many years. This core truth underscores that cultural literacy is built, not just learned. Operation Grafe exemplified both the powerful potential of special operations and their inherent limitations. Small, highly skilled units engaged in unconventional missions can instigate disruptions that far surpass their numerical strength. The psychological impact of their actions can magnify the tangible tactical results by many magnitudes, influencing attitudes and morale across entire regions. But such influence is inherently dependent on creating conditions, conventional military victories or strategic leverage, that set the stage for these psychological and operational effects to take hold. Without these foundational successes, such as occupying key positions or disrupting enemy command, special operations alone cannot deliver comprehensive strategic victories. Deception, no matter how cunning or elaborate, can never fully replace outright military triumphs. For historians and military strategists, Operation Grafe remains a compelling case study illustrating these dynamics vividly. It demonstrates how an overly ambitious plan, divorced from the realities of military and operational constraints, is doomed to fail. Hitler's late war decision-making offers a stark parallel. Grand plans that were imaginative but lacked sufficient resources or realistic assessment of capabilities. These endeavors, despite their ambitious scope, were ultimately divorced from battlefield realities, leading to failure. Yet, amid these failures, an unintended lesson emerged. The success of the operation's psychological component, its ability to generate panic and chaos, validated the concept that psychological warfare and deception could serve as powerful force multipliers, even when the plans fell short tactically. The stories of the 17 men who perished before firing squads, victims of their attempts to wear enemy uniforms, are unlikely to be remembered without the careful preservation in historical records. They were not prominent figures nor particularly influential individuals prior to their capture. Their operation, altogether, ended in complete failure, that much was clear. Nevertheless, their executions marked a significant turning point in military and legal history, elucidating the legal boundaries surrounding the use of enemy uniforms in warfare. Their tragic fate became a lesson, whose echoes endure in the legal discourse surrounding identity verification and the rules of engagement. This episode underscores a core truth. Cultural knowledge and genuine identity verification are exceedingly difficult for outsiders to fake convincingly and expediently. While special operations remain valuable tools in modern warfare, capable of spectacular disruption and psychological impact, they are not substitutes for the hard-won, tangible achievements of conventional military campaigns. The laws that govern armed conflict continue to emphasize that deception and disguise can never entirely replace actual military success, nor can they justify outright violations of established legal norms. In sum, the lessons drawn from this episode reaffirm that one's understanding of culture, identity, and legality requires depth and authenticity. Such knowledge must be built over time through real immersed experience, not superficial imitation or quick learning. It is precisely this truth that continues to shape advanced military strategies, guiding contemporary war, unpredictably complex and often fraught with moral ambiguity, remains an arena where the lines between legality, necessity, and human suffering are frequently blurred. Its toll extends far beyond the battlefield, touching every aspect of human life and society. For instance, the tragic consequence of fatal executions conducted after prisoners are captured demonstrates how the human costs of conflict extrapolate into matters of life and death, often governed by laws that are subject to interpretation depending on the circumstances and available evidence. These executions are not mere statistics. They represent the cessation of individual lives, each a person with a unique background, family, personal history, and a future that was abruptly cut short by bullets fired under the auspices of legal authority, following what was purported to be a fair trial process. These solemn acts are embodied by the graves at La Marque, silent witnesses to lives forcibly ended amid war's brutal logic, underscoring the tragic toll that conflicts exact on human dignity. In the context of conflict zones, the actions of soldiers at checkpoints reveal a complex intersection of obedience, psychology, and the fog of war. Consider the American soldiers stationed at a checkpoint, where they questioned individuals about seemingly trivial details such as baseball. This cautious line of inquiry, part of their broader duties, was carried out under strict orders, yet each soldier bore the psychological weight of their actions. Many of these soldiers had experienced the intense moral and emotional stress that comes with executing prisoners, particularly enemies convicted of serious crimes like espionage, sometimes under the pressure of wartime exigencies, which often demand swift and uncompromising decisions. These soldiers' actions, though seemingly mundane or even absurd, were rooted in a dire need to identify infiltration and protect their compatriots, illustrating how wartime operations often involve uncomfortable choices that weigh heavily on individual conscience. Not all efforts in warfare yield dramatic results in terms of targeted successes, such as capturing a significant strategic point, yet their indirect consequences can ripple far beyond initial expectations. For example, a specific operation, codenamed Operation Grief, failed to seize its primary objective. No bridges were captured, and significant destruction was avoided. Despite this, the operation caused a disproportionate psychological impact. It did not inflict numerous casualties among American forces directly, but it created pervasive fear and uncertainty. This atmosphere of suspicion and doubt was a critical strategic dimension, leading to delayed reinforcements, hampered command decisions, and the diversion of valuable resources during crucial initial days of confrontations. While impossible to precisely quantify, this aftermath significantly influenced the early phase of the battle, shaping its overall outcome. The rapid apprehension, trial, and execution of infiltrators within mere days exemplified how the American military judiciary operated under the extreme pressure of wartime demands. Swift administration of justice, often more sensitive to immediate operational needs than to prolonged deliberation, became a wartime precedent in itself. The brevity of the process from capture to execution, notably, mere days, mirrored real combat conditions. Such swiftness, though dangerous by modern standards which emphasize thorough judicial procedures, reinforced a stark reality. Wartime decisions often rely on immediacy, establishing a precedent that would influence future military actions. This approach during the Battle of the Bulge, which persisted for more than 5 weeks following the execution of infiltrators, contributed decisively to the eventual defeat of German forces. With this victory, crucial British and American strategic reserves were preserved and effectively eliminated Germany's last substantial reserve position, shifting the tide of the conflict. Reflecting on the stories surrounding Operation Grief and the Battle of the Bulge reveals that warfare is a multidimensional phenomenon extending far beyond combat alone. The psychological toll, cultural influences, and perceptions generated during times of conflict can be as influential, if not more so, than immediate tactical gains. A poorly executed operation, one that fails decisively on the battlefield but causes widespread panic and confusion, can, in some cases, achieve more profound strategic disruption than a flawless, but discreet, success. The chaos and misinformation stirred by such failures can ripple throughout the broader military and civilian populations, undermining morale and strategic coherence. The interrogations at checkpoints, although sometimes seeming even foolish or inconsequential, proved to be effective precisely because they tested knowledge that only genuine Americans, whether soldiers or civilians, would naturally possess. Infiltrators, despite being trained to mimic their targets, found it difficult to convincingly replicate these genuine specifics, and thus the process served as an informal yet effective safeguard. Those American soldiers engaged in the Battle of the Bulge faced not only an enemy capable of launching a formidable offensive but also a persistent, pervasive suspicion that enemies could be concealed anywhere, wearing any uniform, speaking any language. This pervasive paranoia was born from the unpredictable nature of wartime infiltration, which blurred the lines between ally and enemy in a desperate fight for survival. This erosion of certainty and trust marked a new and unsettling dimension of warfare, one characterized by suspicion, psychological pressure, and the constant threat of deception. It introduced a layer of complexity that would influence military operations and security protocols for decades to